This thing on. From the archives, Portrait of the Cyclist as a Young Man, Part 4. Introduction. This post continues the tale from my archives of how I became a bike racer. In parts 1, 2, and 3, I described how my early infatuation with the sport led to actually participating, the disastrous results of that doomed effort, and how even learning how to train failed to vault me to glory, with all my friends easily passing me by. In this post, I describe my third season and how my minor triumphs were offset by more salt in the wounds, actual and figurative. So as I described in my last post on this topic, after the 1982 Red Zinger Mini Classic, I tried my hand at some USCF races and really didn't get anywhere. So the next year I decided it made sense to race the Mini Zinger again, even if my friends Nico and John had moved on to racing USCF all year. To refresh your memory, they'd finished first and third respectively in the 82 Mini Zinger and cleaned up in the USCF races for the rest of the season. Frankly, their absence was part of the appeal of the Mini Zinger. They wouldn't be around to crush me again and rub my nose in it. To be fair, I was pretty good at rubbing my own nose in it. Besides, the Mini Zinger races seemed a bit better organized than the USCF ones, and the added bonus is that in that less elite field, I could learn some tactics. The 1982 races had taught me that strength wasn't enough, and I had a lot to learn. It's hard to do that when you're off the back, so why would I want to race USCF all year? Over the winter, I borrowed $750 from my dad and bought Nico's old bike, a Mercian Colorado with full campy. He'd gotten the pro deal on a fancier Mercian that matched his teammates' bikes and didn't need this one anymore. The color of my new bike was light brown, which they called champagne pearl. It was more precisely the color of a perfect young fawn. It was the prettiest bike I've ever had. I rode it for a few weeks and then, riding at night without a light, crashed it into a curb, ruining the frame. The down tube got rumpled, the head tube steepened, top tube creased slightly. Even the fork was bent. I was inconsolable. My brothers were really sympathetic and rallied around me in my despair. Ha, 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 ha. Of course that's not true. In fact, they gave me endless crap, insisting that the frame was defective and I was a moron to have bought it in the first place. They contended that because the frame builder had used pins to hold the tubes in place while brazing the frame instead of using a jig for this purpose, that he had introduced horrible strains into the structure that caused it to be inherently weak. For some reason, we were all steeped in this kind of lore and knew for a fact that the Mercians were pinned. Well, my brothers teased me so much that I finally wrote to Frank Berto, the technical guru at Bicycling Magazine. I described the scenario in detail, mentioning my weight and size and the approximate speed of the impact, and how I hit the curb in a perpendicular fashion. I remember this phrase because I had to look up the spelling on perpendicular. Frank, or somebody on his staff, wrote me back directly, assuring me that the frame was not defective, that the pins are a widely accepted way of building a frame, and that any impact of that kind would bend any frame I've made of such lightweight tubing. The letter went on to praise my writing ability. "Sign that boy up," he had written. Well, naturally, this didn't satisfy my brothers, who shifted their mockery to my letter, making up quotes like, "As I hit the curb in an exactly perpendicularly fashion, my lightly muscled body slightly tense, a grimace on my perspiring face." I guess they were paying me back for buying that Mercian in the first place. I had broken some unwritten rule by having a better bike than any of them did. In any case, I couldn't borrow any more money from my dad to buy a new frame, so Jeff gave me a loan on the condition that he choose the make. He chose Miata. So in 1983, I had a Pro Miata, which should have thrilled me, except it was clearly inferior to the Mercian, and I now owed money on two bikes. Still, I had to live up to such a cool bike, so I trained harder than ever, still riding with Nico and John much of the time. That year, I made a couple of new friends, Spencer Crouch and Aaron Pickett-Heaps, and put together a mini Zinger team with the two of them, along with John Lynch, the good racer and good friend from my previous year. So, here's a photo of Spencer and me. I can't even remember what race this was. But look at how great his jersey is. And that thing I'm wearing, it's not even a jersey. I think that might have been a pajama top. Also, notice how suavely Spencer is posing for the camera there. That didn't even occur to me. Perhaps I was still unaware that as a teenager, I was supposed to look cool. Emotionally, I think I was about 10 years old still. I was just happy to be around. What an idiot. Before the Red Zinger proper, the promoters held qualifying races to determine who would be in Division 2, the slower group, and who made Division 1. The first qualifier was the Kittredge Criterium on the campus of the University of Colorado at Boulder. So I went into the race with pretty high hopes, and for the first time ever, things really seemed to fall into place. Got into a 4-man breakaway, and I felt like I was the strongest guy in there. In fact, I started to believe I could actually win the race. Where the heck did that photo go? There we go. So there I am. That's Spencer behind me. And then with just a few laps remaining, I suddenly didn't feel so well, and I totally puked. And the barf was bright red and it went everywhere, scaring the crap out of my breakaway companions. You can see a smear of it. Well, you probably can't on here. On my blog, you can see a smear of that barf on my upper lip. So John Lynch and I had eaten a whole bunch of spaghetti for lunch at his house right before the race. And sauce was made with ground beef, which, I never got at home, so I totally overate. Plus, we lost track of time and had to haul ass over the race. So at least we were warmed up, but it would have been great to have actually digested that food. So, surprise, surprise, I did not win the race. You may be tempted to infer causality between the vomit and me losing, but there was no causality, or not much. Granted, the barfing was distracting, but I felt better afterward. To be honest, the winner, Ellen Copeland, if I recall correctly, beat me for no good reason. I think when it came down to it, I just didn't have the nerve to win. For someone stooped in failure with an upbringing based on the cult of inadequacy, victory would have seemed like overreaching. All the same, I was thrilled with my first podium finish, even though this being a prelim, they didn't actually bring out the podium. After that promising start, things got tough again. The more I rode with Aaron, the stronger he got. Same with Spencer, actually. And in fact, Spencer bet me $5 that he'd beat me in the mini zinger. That seemed pretty cheeky for somebody who had just started the sport, but then this was all par for the course. So, on to the mini zinger. I don't actually remember that much other than the podium continued to elude me. Aaron had become super fast and was trading the race leader's jersey back and forth with this kid named Kevin Smith. Going into the last stage, Aaron trailed by a few points being the basis for the mini zinger's general classification, perhaps so that if a kid crashed out of a stage, he could still take up the race again the next day. So the final stage was on the National Bureau of Standards. It was a criterium, an 8-shaped course on a bit of a hill. And thrillingly, I got into a 3-man breakaway with Kevin and Aaron, and we seemed destined to stay off. Kids tended to give up pretty easily in those days, I'd noticed. And until this day, I'd always noticed this from the perspective of the person giving up. So it started to rain, first soft and then hard. This didn't bother us a bit, though it should have bothered me if I'd known better. You see, I'd punctured right before the race, and I borrowed a wheel from my brother's friend Dave Toll. And little did I realize he'd glued a track tire to this wheel. And that tire probably got great traction in a velodrome indoors. But in the wet, not so much. I come bombing down this 90-degree turn, and I just totally slid out and completely stacked. Game over, man. So I had the good sense to get out of the road before 50 guys ran me over, but then I foolishly slumped on my back on a wet lawn. Somebody summoned the race medics, who went straight to work assessing my injuries. A small crowd gathered, including my brothers, because this was the most exciting corner of the race to watch. That's where my family had set up. And I think my poor, terrified mother was there as well, along with a few random spectators, with a yen for Schadenfreude. The medics seemed to overreact a little bit. Either they'd been bored or maybe it looked like I was going into shock. I was shivering quite a bit, but it wasn't shock. It's that I had like 2% body fat and was lying in wet grass. So the medics cut my shorts open, which I guess is standard operating procedure for those guys. So I'm lying on my back, all these people looking down at me, and I felt my unit fall out of under its flap of the lycra, so it was in plain view of everybody. So I kind of, poked that back under there. And for some reason, this seemed to be, to my brothers, just evidence, damning evidence of my obviously faked injury. So they figured if I had the presence of mind to cover up Rollo, I should have been able to get right back on my bike, jump back in the race, and catch up. I suppose a more heroic racer would have done just that, but I was not that heroic racer. I was just a 13-year-old kid, and it hurt to crash. And when the adults took control of the situation, it didn't occur to me to shrug anything off and get back in the race. I suppose I could have at least told everybody I was okay, but maybe it didn't occur to me at the time that I was okay. At least, not then. So I was ambulanced to the hospital, and at some point my dad materialized, and he sat next to my gurney in the ER helping to fill out the insurance paperwork. And, he was remarkably cheerful. He didn't even take the opportunity to remind me that he'd warned my brothers and me of this. Chickens had come home to roost, and my own stupidity had gotten me into this mess. If you don't recall this from part one, my dad had forbidden my brothers and me to race on the grounds that you boys are too stupid to be bike racers. You'll get yourselves killed. But, Dad made light fun of the redundant and poorly conceived questions on the form. The form could have simply given a place for the patient or his guardian to write a brief description of what happened, but instead it tried to shoehorn the reporter into shaping a narrative out of multiple choice or short answer questions. The question I remember best was something like, did you/patient encounter an impact with any object? My dad asked whether I thought the ground was an appropriate response. I did, and he wrote it in. Then a doctor or a nurse, heck, maybe it was an orderly, came and scrubbed my road rash with a toothbrush. Somewhere there's a photo of this, which would be very handy now because I remember the road rash as having been about the size of an orange. Perhaps I inflated it in the telling so that it became a grapefruit. In any case, in my brother's telling, it started out a tennis ball, and in successive retellings became a plum, then a cherry, then a raisin. Ask them today, and they'll probably say I didn't have any road rash at all. You should totally ask them. They'd love to tell you this story in their own words, especially the part about how I was obviously unscathed because I had the presence of mind to cover my male member when it flopped out in front of the hordes of disgusted spectators. I'd be delighted to learn what new, shocking details they'd add to the story now. So on the basis of that crash, I dropped from 4th or 5th overall on the mini zinger down to 7th. I was pretty disappointed, having really thought the podium would be in reach. At least I did beat Spencer, who, as you'll recall, had bet me $5 he'd beat me in the general classification. I spent the rest of the summer trying to get him to pay up. Eventually, I had to settle for $2 and a little sunglasses leash. He had an extra. But there's a silver lining to this story. The day after crashing out of that criterium, as I spent the day convalescing in bed, I decided to have lunch brought to me. One of my prizes for the mini zinger was a gift certificate at Quiznos, good for lunch for two. So I offered John a free meal if he'd go to fetch it. So he borrowed my 3-speed and headed out. Well, he was gone a lot longer than I expected, and when he finally returned, he had road rash of his own. The Cokes were pretty much empty, and the sandwiches were soaked. On the ride back, going pretty fast despite balancing our lunch in its cardboard tray on his handlebars, he'd run over a squirrel and totally stacked. While he was lying there on the bike path, the wind knocked out of him. Some typically pro-animal boulderite stopped to bawl him out for having maimed the squirrel. Shoot, did I say my cloudy mini zinger tail had a silver lining? More like pewter or even lead. To be continued. Check back in a month or so for the thrilling finale, my brave return to the USCF circuit, and how my ongoing mediocrity undermined my closest friendships.